Before we begin, let the modern world soften at its edges. Imagine a time when language was an art of honor, when ideals of virtue, beauty, and duty were spoken with careful grace. Welcome. This is not just an audiobook. This is a literary listening experience. Here, stories are offered with attentive narration, shaped by emotional pacing and atmosphere, and designed for calm immersion and reflection. You will not simply hear the words of a text, but sense the world that formed them, the cadence of an era, the moral air its people breathed. Before the story begins, you will be gently introduced to the author, the period, and the cultural texture surrounding this work. After the story ends, there will be a quiet reflection, a distilled insight from its essence, followed by one or two questions to carry with you. Tonight, we turn toward Arcadia, and toward a world that opens with pastoral calm, noble exile, and lives quietly set in motion. Let us step into the story. There is a soft, idealized light in the world you are about to enter, a landscape shaped as much by thought as by geography. This is a realm where shepherds speak with philosophers' tongues, where love and loyalty are tested not by noise, but by inner resolve. Beneath the elegance of its setting lies a deep attention to the human spirit, its virtues, its hesitations, its longing for harmony. Listening here is like walking through a carefully tended garden, where every path invites reflection and every pause holds meaning. The work you are about to hear is Arcadia, a prose romance written in the late 16th century, likely between 1578 and 1580. It was first published in 1590, several years after the author's death. Originally written in English, Arcadia comes from England at the height of the Elizabethan Renaissance, a period marked by courtly refinement, classical learning, and a deep faith in the moral power of literature. Its author, Sir Philip Sidney, was born in 1554 and died in 1586. An English nobleman, courtier, soldier, and writer, Sidney was widely regarded in his lifetime as the ideal gentleman of the Elizabethan age. Educated at Oxford and shaped by travel and diplomatic service, he moved easily between politics, culture, and letters. His literary legacy rests on both prose and poetry, including Arcadia, an apology for poetry, and the sonnet sequence Astrophel and Stella. Though his life was brief, his influence was enduring. He wrote across genres, romance, criticism, lyric poetry, and his thinking helped shape the future of English prose. Beyond literature, his public service and heroic death in battle sealed his reputation as a figure in whom art and action were closely joined. Why does Arcadia still matter today? Because beneath its ornate style and idealized setting lies a timeless concern with how individuals live well in a complex world. Written in an age deeply invested in honor, virtue, and self-fashioning, the story reflects questions that remain with us still. How to balance desire with duty, emotion with reason, private feeling with public role. In our own time, no less shaped by expectation and performance, these tensions feel familiar. This story speaks especially to listeners who value psychological depth, moral inquiry, and the slow unfolding of thought, rather than spectacle or haste. If you enjoy this kind of literary listening experience, where stories are approached with care, context, and quiet intelligence, you are warmly invited to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps sustain a space devoted to literature as an art of listening. Now, settle in. Enjoy watching, enjoy listening, and remember, after the story concludes, there will be a short reflection and a few gentle anecdotes drawn from its heart. I encourage you not to miss them. And now, we begin. Sir Philip Sidney. Arcadia. Sir Philip Sidney, the finest type of gentleman of Elizabethan days, was born on November 30th, 1554, at Penshurst, Kent, the eldest son of Sir Henry Sidney, Lord Deputy in Ireland, and grandson, on his mother's side, of the Duke of Northumberland, who was beheaded for complicity in the Lady Jane Grey conspiracy. Education at Oxford, travel abroad, diplomatic service, a wise interest in literature, and a singular graciousness of character made Sidney a full man. He was regarded, at home and abroad, as the ideal gentleman of his time, and a heroic death at the siege of Zutphen on October 2nd, 1586, enhanced his fame. His body was brought home for a national funeral in Old St. Paul's. Sidney's claims as a writer are based on both prose, Arcadia, and An Apology for Poetry, and verse, Astrophel and Stella. The elaborate and artificial romance Arcadia was written for his sister Mary, Countess of Pembroke, probably between 1578 to 80. It was left incomplete and was not published until 4 years after his death. It has been described as forming the earliest model for the art of prose. In our epitome, we have followed the central thread of a story which has innumerable episodic extensions. Lost and found. It was the time that the earth begins to put on her new apparel against the approach of her lover, when the shepherd, Strephon, on the sands which lie against the island of Cythera, called upon him his friendly rival Claeus, and bewailed their hopeless wooing of the fair shepherdess, Urania, whose beauty taught the beholders chastity. As they were going on with their praises, they perceived the thing which floated nearer and nearer to the shore by the favorable working of the sea, till it was cast up hard before them, and they fully saw it was a man. So they fell to rub and chafe him, till they brought him to recover both breath, the servant, and warmth, the companion of living. Whereupon, without so much as thanking them for their pains, he got up and cried, as he looked round to the uttermost limits of his sight, "What? Shall Musidorus live after Pyrocles' destruction?" Then they, hearing him speak in Greek, which was their natural language, became the more tender-hearted towards him. "Since you take care of me," said he, "I pray you find some bark that will go out of the haven, that it possible we may find the body of Pyrocles." So Claeus presently went to a fisherman, and having agreed with him, and provided some apparel for the naked stranger, they embarked, and were no sooner gone beyond the mouth of the haven than they discerned the ship burning, which had driven both Musidorus and his friend, rather to commit themselves to the cold mercy of the sea than to abide the hot cruelty of the fire. And when they had bent their course as near up to it as they could, they saw, but a little way off, the mast, whose proud height now lay along, and upon it a young man who sat as on horseback, holding a sword aloft which often he waved, which when Musidorus saw he was ravished with joy. But now the sailors described a galley which came with sails and oars directly in the chase of them, and straight they perceived it was a well-known pirate. So forthwith they set on all the canvas, and flew homeward, leaving in that poor sort Pyrocles, so near to be rescued. And Musidorus, casting a long look that way, saw the galley leave the pursuit of them, and turned to take up the spoils of the wreck. And lastly, he might well see them lift up the young man. But the fisherman made such speed into the haven that they absented his eyes from beholding the issue, and he could procure neither them nor any other to put to sea again. The honest shepherds, Strephon and Claeus, seeing sickness grew something upon their companion, offered to bring him into their own country of Arcadia, upon the next confines whereof dwelt a gentleman, by name Calendar, who for his hospitality was much haunted, and for his upright dealing beloved of his neighbors. To this Musidorus gave easy assent, and so they came to Arcadia, which welcomed Musidorus's eyes with delightful prospects. These were hills garnished with stately trees, humble valleys comforted with the refreshing of silver rivers, meadows enameled with eye-pleasing flowers, pastures stored with sheep feeding in sober security. Here a young shepherdess knitting and singing withal, and there a shepherd boy piping as though he should never be old. As they came near the house, Claeus asked to know something more of Musidorus, and the young man he lamented, that they might inform Calendar how to proportion his entertainment. Musidorus, according to an agreement between Pyrocles and himself to alter their names, answered that he called himself Palladius, and his friend Diophantus. And Calander, judging his guest, was of no mean calling, and seeing him possessed with an extreme burning fever, conveyed him to commodious lodging in his house, and respectfully entertained him. And the young shepherds went away, leaving Musidorus loath to part with them. There Palladius continued some while, with no great hope of life, but youth at length got the victory of sickness. Palladius, having gotten his health, Calander, who found in him a piercing wit, void of ostentation, high-erected thoughts seated in a heart of courtesy, and a behavior so noble as gave a majesty to adversity, and enamored with a fatherly love towards him, proceeded to tell him of Arcadia. Here dwelleth and reigneth Prince Basilius, who, being already well stricken in years, married a young princess Gynecia, of notable beauty, and of these two are brought to the world 2 daughters, the elder named Pamela, the younger Philoclea, both beyond measure excellent in all the gifts allotted to reasonable creatures. When I marked them, methought there was more sweetness in Philoclea, but more majesty in Pamela. Methought Philoclea's beauty only persuaded, but so persuaded as all hearts must yield. Pamela's beauty used violence, and such violence as no heart could resist. Philoclea, so bashful as though her excellencies had stolen into her before she was aware. Pamela of high thoughts, who avoids pride by making it one of her excellencies to be void of pride. Now Basilius hath retired himself, his wife and children, into a forest hereby, which he calleth his desert, having appointed a nobleman named Philanax to be prince regent, and most worthy so to be. And this Basilius doth, because he means not, while he breathes, that his daughter shall have any husbands, but keep them solitary with him. Some few days afterwards, Palladius perceived by the behavior of Calander, who had retired himself to his chamber, that an ill-pleasing accident had fallen out. Whereupon he called to the steward and desired the truth, who confessed that his master had received news that his son, Clitophon, who was near the day of his marriage, had been made prisoner at a battle between the Lacedaemon and the Helots, when going to deliver a friend of his taken prisoner by the Helots, and every hour he was to look for nothing but some cruel death, though he had offered great ransom for his life, which death, hitherunto, had only been delayed by the captain of the Helots, who seemed to have a heart of more manly pity than the rest. Hearing this, Palladius thanked the steward, and then, well bethinking himself, called for armor, a horse, and guide, and armed all saving the head, went to Calander, who had banished food and sleep as enemies to mourning, and said, no more of this, my lord Calander, let us labor to find before we lament the loss. And with those words comfort seemed to lighten in his eyes, and in his face and gesture was painted victory. Calander's spirits were so revived that he himself guided Palladius to the place upon the frontiers, where already were assembled several thousand men, all well disposed for Calander's sake to abide any peril. So Palladius marched on the town of Cardamila, where Clitophon was captive, and having by a stratagem obtained entry, put the Helots to flight. But ere the Arcadians could reach the prison, the captain of the Helots, who had been absent, returned and rallied them. Then the fight grew most sharp, and the encounters of cruel obstinacy, and such was the overflowing of the valor of Palladius that the captain of the Helots saw he alone was worth all the rest of the Arcadians, and disdaining to fight any other, sought only to join with him, which mind was no less in Palladius. So they began a combat, surpassing in bravery, and, as it were, delightful terribleness, till, both sides beginning to wax faint, the captain of the Helots strake Palladius upon the side of the head, and withal his helmet fell off. Other of the Arcadians were ready to shield him from any harm which might rise of that nakedness, but little needed it, for his chief enemy kneeled down, offering to deliver the pommel of his sword, in token of yielding, withal saying aloud that he thought it more liberty to be his prisoner than any other's general. Palladius, standing upon himself, and misdoubting some craft, "What?" said the captain, "hath Palladius forgotten the voice of Diophantus?" And by that watchword Palladius knew it was his only friend Pyrocles, whom he had lost upon the sea, and therefore both caused the retreat to be sounded. And of the Arcadian side, the good old Calendar, striving more than his old age could achieve, was taken prisoner, but being led towards the captain of the Helots, whom should he see next the captain but his son Clitiphon? Then were Calendar and Clitiphon delivered to the Arcadians without ransom, for so the Helots agreed, being moved by the authority of Diophantus as much as persuaded by his reasons, and to Palladius, for so he called Musidorus, he sent word by Clitiphon that he would himself repair to Arcadia, having dispatched himself of the Helots. Also, he assured them he would bring with him Clitiphon's friend, Aroglas, till then kept in close prison, or he would die. And this he did, and was received with loving joy by Calendar. The Lover's Quest. The two friends, having accounted their adventures to each other since they parted, embraced and kissed each other, and then told Calendar the whole story. And Palladius recounted also to Pyrocles the strange story of Arcadia and its king. And so they lived for some days in great contentment. But anon, it could not be hid from Palladius that Diophantus was grown weary of his abode in Arcadia, seeing the court could not be visited, but was prohibited to all men save certain shepherdish people. And one day, when Calendar had invited them to the hunting of a goodly stag, Diophantus was missed, after death had been sent to the poor beast with a crossbow, and on returning to the house, Palladius, greatly marveling, lighted on a letter written by Pyrocles before he went a-hunting, in which he said that violence of love led to his absence. Then Palladius determined never to leave, seeking him till his search should be either by meeting accomplished or by death ended. So, in private guise, he directed his course to Laconia, and passed through Achaia and Cyonia, and returned after 2 months' travail in vain. Having already passed over the greater part of Arcadia, one day, going to repose himself in a little wood, he saw a fair lady walking with her side towards him, whose sword interested her to be an Amazon, and following her warily to a fine close arbor, he heard her sing, with a voice no less beautiful to his ears than her goodliness was full of harmony to his sight. The ditty gave him suspicion, and the voice gave him assurance who the singer was, and entering boldly, he perceived it was Pyrocles thus disguised. Then Pyrocles told him he had been infected by love through a sight of the picture of the king's daughter Philoclea, and by what he had heard of her, and, in the guise of an Amazon, and under the name of Zelmane, had come forth to seek her. As a supposed niece to the queen of the Amazons, he had been gently received by King Basilius in his sylvan retirement, and introduced to his queen and daughters, with the effect that he was more than ever in love with the Princess Philoclea, while old Basilius, deceived as to his sex, showed signs of a doting admiration which choked him with its tediousness. So Musidorus returned to a village not far off, and Zelmane returned to the part of the forest where the king kept his seclusion. When Zelmane next returned to the arbor where she had met Musidorus, she saw, walking from herward, a man in shepherdish apparel, with a sheep-hook in his right hand, and singing as he went a lamentable tune. The voice made her hasten her pace to overtake him, for she plainly perceived it was her dear friend Musidorus. Then Musidorus recounted how sojourning in secret, and watching by the arbor, he had observed and loved the Princess Pamela, and was now under the name of Doris, disguised as one of the shepherds who were allowed the princess's presence. And so it happened that when Basilius, the better to breed Zelmane's liking, appointed a fair field for shepherdish pastimes, Zelmane and Doris were both of the company, Doris still keeping his eye on Pamela, and Zelmane setting the hand of Philoclea to her lips, when suddenly there came out of a wood a monstrous lion, with a she-bear not far from him, of little less fierceness. Philoclea no sooner espied the lion than she leapt up and ran lodgeward, as fast as her delicate legs could carry her, while Doris drew Pamela behind a tree, where she stood quaking like the partridge which the hawk is ready to seize. The Zelmane, to whom danger was a cause of dreadlessness, slew the lion and carried the head to Philoclea, while Pamela was seen coming, and having in her hand the paw of the bear which the shepherd Doris had presented unto her. And while Philoclea applied precious balm to a wound of no importance which Zelmane had received, Pamela's noble heart would needs make known gratefully the valiant means of her safety. And now the two friends sought to make known their true estate to Philoclea and Pamela. So Doris, feigning a love and attendance on Pamela, told her, in the presence of her mistress, the story of the two friends, Pyrocles and Musidorus, but in such words that Pamela understood who it was that was speaking, and carried to Philoclea the news that her Doris had fallen out to be none other than the Prince Musidorus, famous over all Asia for his heroical enterprises. And, later, Pyrocles, finding himself in private conference with Philoclea, did avow himself Prince of Macedon, and her true lover, and they passed the promise of marriage. And she, to entertain him from a more straight parley, did entreat him to tell the story of his life, and what he did until he came to the shipwreck. Through perils to peace. By the mischievous device of Cecropia, aunt to the princesses, both were carried away, with Zelmane, and imprisoned in her castle in the hope that Philoclea would favor the suit of her cousin Amphialus, Cecropia's son. But Philoclea remained faithful to her love for Pyrocles, and Pamela faithful to her love for Musidorus, who brought up an army and stormed the castle and rescued the prisoners. The princes, becoming tired of inaction and foreseeing no favorable issue to their concealed suits, persuaded the princesses to attempt an escape with them to their own dominions, and such was the trust Pamela placed in Musidorus and Philoclea in Pyrocles that they became willing companions in the flight. But when Musidorus and Pamela had escaped, and Pyrocles sought Philoclea in her room to carry her away, he found she was unable to undertake the fatigue of the journey, and Demetas, the clownish guardian of the princess, discovering the presence of Pyrocles in the room, locked the door on the inside and raised an alarm. Musidorus and Pamela, too, were surprised, secured, and brought back. Now, by the laws of the Arcadians, both the princesses and their lovers had forfeited their lives by their indiscretions, but King Basilius was removed from the seat of judgment by drinking a potion of drugged wine, which the queen, not without warning to the king, had prepared for Zelmane. It was left, therefore, to Phalanx, the regent, to deal with the difficulties that surrounded the administration of justice, the offenses of Musidorus and Pyrocles, of Philoclea and Pamela, who now became heir to the throne, and the complicity of the queen in the death of the king. At this moment, Euarchus, king of Macedon, arrived with a small escort on a visit to his friend King Basilius, and, by common consent, was asked to deliver judgment on the several prisoners. His decisions were that the queen should be buried quick with the body of her husband, that Philoclea should be kept a prisoner as a Vestal nun, that Pyrocles should be thrown out of a high tower to receive his death by his fall, and that Musidorus should be beheaded. At this moment, a stranger broke through the press and astonished the multitude with his cries. Then, falling at the feet of Euarchus, he told him those whom he had judged were his own son, the comfort of Macedon, and his nephew, the only stay of Thessalia, who, during their wanderings, had grown out of the knowledge of their king. Then Euarchus, after staying a good while upon himself like a valiant man that should receive a good encounter, at length said, O Arcadians, that what this day I have said hath been out of my assured persuasion what justice itself and your just laws require. Now, contrary to expectation, I find the guilty to be my only son and nephew. But shall justice halt? Or rather, shall all my private respects give place to that holy name? Let the remnant of my life be an inward and outward desolation, but never, never let sacred rightfulness fall. Therefore, O Phalanx, see the judgment rightly performed. But this pitiful matter was not entered into, for King Basilius, who had been thought dead, awoke from the sleep into which the potion had cast him, and there was much ado to make him understand what had fallen out. Then, having weighed these things, he first sent with all honorable pomp for his queen Ganetia, and told them how she had warned him to take heed of the drink. And next, with princely entertainment to Euarchus, and to his inestimable joy, the marriage was concluded between the peerless princes and princesses. As we close this passage from Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia, we are not merely stepping away from a pastoral romance, but from a carefully staged experiment in what prose, psychology, and idealism could become at the very dawn of modern literature. Arcadia is often remembered for its ornate style and labyrinthine plot, yet beneath its elaborate surface lies something quieter and far more radical, a meditation on identity, loyalty, and the fragile architecture of the self when stripped of certainty. Sidney writes at a moment when English prose is still discovering its own authority. This work, composed not for public acclaim, but as a private gift to his sister Mary, Countess of Pembroke, occupies a unique space between intimacy and ambition. It borrows the pastoral innocence of classical romance, yet infuses it with Renaissance anxiety. The world of Arcadia looks gentle, sunlit, and musical, but it is constantly interrupted by loss, disguise, and moral trial. In this opening scene alone, the earth dresses herself against the approach of her lover, a lush metaphor for renewal, while a body washes ashore, silent evidence of chaos beneath harmony. Nature celebrates continuity, while human lives fracture. The shepherds Strephon and Claeus appear at first as conventional pastoral figures, lamenting unfulfilled love, yet their beloved Urania is no ordinary object of desire. She is described as a beauty that taught the beholder's chastity, a paradox that reveals one of Sidney's central symbolic strategies. Urania is less a woman than an ideal, a living embodiment of virtue so elevated it arrests appetite rather than inflaming it. She represents the Renaissance tension between earthly love and moral aspiration, the impossibility of reconciling desire with purity. In this sense, Urania is not meant to be possessed. She is meant to be contemplated and, inevitably, lost. Then comes the intrusion. A man cast up by the sea, rescued without ceremony, who rises not in gratitude but in despair. Musidorus' cry, "Shall Musidorus live after Pyrocles' destruction?" is one of the most revealing moments in Arcadia. Identity here is relational. To lose Pyrocles is not merely to lose a friend, but to lose the self that existed in reflection of another. Friendship, in Sidney's moral universe, is not supplemental to identity. It is foundational. Musidorus' shadow self emerges in this moment. His flaw is not weakness, but absolutism. Loyalty so total that survival itself feels like betrayal. Sidney, who lived by a strict code of honor and died refusing water meant for another wounded soldier, understood this psychology intimately. The ideal gentleman, when pushed to extremes, risks self-erasure. What appears noble can quietly become destructive. Critics across centuries have noted that Arcadia is less about plot than about ethical testing. Its characters are placed in scenarios designed to strain virtue under pressure, to ask whether ideals can survive contact with reality. The shipwreck is not merely an adventure trope, it is a symbolic stripping away. Titles, courts, and protections vanish. What remains is language, memory, and moral choice. When we look at this through a modern lens, the resonance deepens. Musidorus' crisis mirrors a phenomenon well documented in contemporary psychology: identity foreclosure, the collapse that occurs when a person defines themselves entirely through a single role or relationship. In today's digital culture, we see echoes of this everywhere. Social media profiles, algorithmic feeds, and professional branding systems encourage us to compress ourselves into legible identities. When those identities fracture through loss, cancellation, or failure, the sense of self can feel just as shipwrecked as Musidorus on the shore of Cythera. What was once a pastoral metaphor now feels eerily contemporary. The sea that delivers Musidorus is not unlike the vast, impersonal systems of modern life, data streams, markets, networks that carry us forward without concern for who survives the crossing. And the shepherds, ordinary observers, become first responders, not because they are powerful, but because they are present. Sidney reminds us that humanity often re-enters the story not through grand institutions, but through small, compassionate acts. So, we're left with questions that refuse to age. If your identity were built around loyalty to one person, one ideal, one mission, what would remain if it disappeared overnight? If Musidorus had access to today's technologies, constant communication, digital memorials, artificial continuations of the self, would his grief be softened or endlessly prolonged? And finally, the moral dilemma lingers. If you were Musidorus, standing on that shore, alive when someone you defined yourself by is gone, would you choose to keep living? Or would survival itself feel like a kind of moral failure? The beauty of literature is that it changes depending on who is holding the book. Arcadia does not hand us answers, it hands us mirrors. I invite you to share your reflections in the comments, how this story speaks to you, here and now, in a world Sidney could never have imagined, yet somehow understood. If you find value in these deep dives into the human soul and enjoy exploring the intersection of classic literature with modern thought, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. Your support ensures that these stories continue to be told and re-examined for a new generation.